On the 14th lap of the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix, a car hit the wall at turn 17. It looked like nothing much. A young driver having a moment on a street circuit, at night, on a track nobody had ever raced on before. Singapore was brand new that year, the first night race in the history of Formula One, run under floodlights on public roads, with concrete barriers a few feet from the racing line. Cars were going to hit things. That was expected. The safety car came out, which is what happens when a car is in the wall on a street circuit. And under that safety car, the race turned completely upside down. And Fernando Alonso, who had started 15th and had already made what looked like a bizarre early pit stop, came out in front and won the race. At the time, it was described as an inspired strategy call, a gamble that happened to pay off. It was not a gamble. The crash was deliberate. It had been arranged in advance, discussed in a meeting, and executed to order. And it is the only proven case of a fixed race in the history of Formula One. This is the story of Crashgate, and the part that still makes people uncomfortable is not the cheating. It's that the method involved deliberately putting a car into a wall at high speed, at night, on a circuit lined with barriers and marshals, and that everyone involved understood exactly what they were asking for. And it's worth understanding what Singapore was, because the setting is not incidental. Formula One had never run a night race. The proposal was to close public roads in the centre of a major city, install a lighting system bright enough to race under, and run a Grand Prix in the dark, primarily so that the timing would suit European television audiences. The lighting alone was an enormous engineering undertaking, involving thousands of light projectors positioned to eliminate shadows and glare across the whole circuit, with backup power systems in case anything failed mid-race. And the circuit itself is one of the most punishing on the calendar. It's long, it's slow, it's bumpy because it's public road, and it has more corners than almost anywhere else. The barriers are close. There is essentially no runoff. Drivers describe it as physically brutal, particularly in the heat and humidity, and it consistently produces safety cars, which is precisely why the plan worked, and precisely why it was so reckless. The safety car probability at Singapore is high enough that a car in the wall surprises nobody. That's the cover. An accident there is entirely unremarkable, which is what made the whole thing invisible. And at the same time, it is the circuit where a deliberate accident is most dangerous, because the barriers are immediately there, the recovery is difficult, and the visibility for following drivers is worst. So they chose the venue where nobody would question it, which was also the venue where it was most likely to go badly wrong. Start with why Renault were desperate, because the motive is the whole thing. Fernando Alonso had won back-to-back world championships with Renault in 2005 and 2006. Then he left for McLaren, had the catastrophic single season we've covered elsewhere, and came back to Renault for 2008. And the car was not good. Renault had fallen off badly. Alonso, a double world champion at the peak of his ability, was driving a midfield machine and going nowhere. The team had not won a race all season. That matters commercially. Renault was a manufacturer team, answerable to a car company board, spending an enormous amount of money on a program that was returning nothing. There was real speculation about whether the manufacturer would stay in the sport at all. So there was pressure. Serious, career-threatening, program-threatening pressure. Now the other side of it, which is the young driver. Nelson Piquet Jr. was in his first full season. His father, Nelson Piquet Sr., is a three-time world champion, one of the genuinely great drivers of the 80s, which meant the son arrived carrying a name that guaranteed attention and guaranteed unfavourable comparison. And he was struggling. He was being comprehensively beaten by Alonso, which is not shameful, because Alonso was one of the 2 or 3 best drivers alive. But the results weren't there, and his seat was visibly under threat. And here is the detail that makes this whole story work, and it's the one that turns it from a cheating scandal into something darker. Flavio Briatore was the managing director of the Renault team. He was also, personally, Nelson Piquet Jr.'s manager. So the man deciding whether Piquet kept his Formula One drive, and the man who represented Piquet's commercial interests, and the man running the team that needed a result were the same person. There is no version of that arrangement that is healthy. It means a young driver in his first season has no independent advocate, nobody to advise him against his employer's interests, and one person holding his entire future. Now the plan, and the way it works, is genuinely clever, which is part of why it's so unpleasant. A safety car in Formula One neutralizes the race. Everyone slows, the field bunches up, and the gaps that drivers spent an hour building disappear. And crucially, a pit stop under a safety car costs you far less time than a normal one because everyone else is going slowly too. So the timing of a safety car is one of the largest random factors in any race. A driver who has just pitted before a safety car comes out gains enormously. A driver who hasn't yet pitted loses enormously, which means that if you knew in advance exactly when a safety car was going to appear, you could pit your driver at precisely the right moment and hand him an advantage worth an enormous number of positions. You would just need somebody to cause the safety car on cue. And that's the plan. Alonso would qualify wherever he qualified, start on a very light fuel load so he could pit early, come in on a chosen lap, and then Piquet would crash on a specified lap at a specified corner, bringing out the safety car and freezing the race, with Alonso already having completed the stop that everyone else still needed to make. The corner chosen was turn 17, and the choice was not random. It's a section with no crane access nearby and no easy recovery, which meant a car stopped there was likely to require a full safety car rather than a quick local recovery. That is a level of planning that removes any possibility of this being a spur-of-the-moment decision, and on the day, it worked exactly as designed. Alonso pitted on lap 12 from well down the order, which made no strategic sense whatsoever and was noted as odd by commentators at the time. 2 laps later, Piquet put the car into the wall. The safety car came out. The pit lane filled with everybody else, and Alonso emerged at the front. He won the race. Renault got their first victory of the season. The manufacturer got its headline, and for almost a year, nobody knew. And it's worth being precise about what arranged actually means here, because the detail is what removes any possibility of innocent explanation. This was not a driver being told to have a scruffy lap. It was a specific corner on a specific lap at a specific point in the race, chosen because of what it would force the race control to do. Think about what has to be true for that to work. Somebody had to know the pit stop windows. Somebody had to model where Alonso would emerge if the field was neutralized at that exact moment. Somebody had to identify which corner would produce a full safety car rather than a local yellow flag or a quick recovery. And then all of that had to be communicated to a driver and executed. That's a strategy exercise. The same modeling work that a team does legitimately every weekend, applied to an outcome they intended to manufacture rather than react to. And there's a detail that makes it colder still. Piquet later described being shown a diagram of the circuit and being asked whether he understood which corner was meant. That is not an ambiguous conversation. That is a briefing. Now, the counter-argument that gets made, and it deserves an honest hearing, is that Piquet was the one who actually did it. Nobody forced his hands on the wheel. He could have said no, driven a bad race, and lost his seat, which is a career consequence rather than a moral catastrophe. And that's fair as far as it goes. He made a choice, and it was a bad one, and he has said as much himself since. But the reason most people who look at this land on the team rather than the driver is the power differential. When the person asking controls both your current employment and your entire professional representation, no is not a neutral option with a small cost. It's a decision to end your career against the only person who could have extended it. That doesn't make him blameless. It does explain why the sanctions were aimed where they were aimed. Now, how it came out, because that's a story about power. In the middle of the 2009 season, Renault dropped Nelson Piquet Jr. His Formula One career was effectively over, and the man who had ended it was also his manager. At which point Piquet, along with his father, went to the FIA and told them what had happened. And the significance of the father being involved should not be underestimated. Nelson Piquet Sr. was a 3-time world champion with standing in the sport, and the resources to be taken seriously. A 24-year-old discarded driver making an accusation against a team principal is easy to dismiss. The same accusation with a triple world champion standing behind it is not. Piquet Jr. was granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, which is a decision people still argue about, because he was the one who actually drove the car into the wall. The investigation moved quickly. Renault initially denied it and threatened legal action, and then, shortly before the hearing, the position collapsed entirely. The team announced it would not contest the charges. Flavio Briatore and Pat Simmons, the executive director of engineering, both left the team. And then came the sanctions, which are the strangest part of the whole affair. Renault, as a team, received a disqualification from the World Championship that was suspended for 2 years, meaning that, provided they didn't do anything else, nothing actually happened to them. Briatore was banned indefinitely from any event sanctioned by the FIA, which was effectively a life ban from the sport. Simmons received 5 years. Then, in 2010, a French court annulled both bans on procedural grounds, finding that the FIA had not followed proper process in imposing them. A settlement between the parties followed, and both men were eventually able to return to motorsport in some capacity, with Simmons later working in senior technical roles in Formula One. So the record of the most serious case of race fixing the sport has ever had reads, the team received a suspended penalty that never took effect. The 2 men banned had those bans annulled by a court, and the driver who caused the crash was given immunity. Nobody was left holding a meaningful sanction. Now, the question that always comes up, which is, what Alonso knew. He was investigated and cleared. The FIA found no evidence that he had any knowledge of the plan, and that has remained the position ever since. And the argument for that is genuinely strong, and it's worth stating properly rather than waving away. A driver does not decide his own strategy. He is told when to pit by his engineers, and pitting on lap 12 would have been presented to him as a strategy call. Drivers query strange calls all the time and are told to trust the pit wall. And critically, if you were designing this plan, telling the driver is pure downside. It adds a person who could refuse, could talk, or could react suspiciously on the radio. The plan works better if he doesn't know. So he won a race he did not know had been fixed, which is its own peculiar kind of unpleasant, because that victory is on his record, and there is nothing he can do about it. Now the part that actually matters most, and which gets less attention than the politics. This plan required a Formula One car to be put into a barrier on purpose, at racing speed, at night, on a street circuit. Motor racing crashes are not controllable. A driver can aim for a wall, but he cannot control what the car does when it arrives, whether it comes back across the track, whether debris goes anywhere, or what happens to anybody else who arrives at that corner in the next few seconds. There were marshals at that corner. There were recovery crews who would have to go to the car. There were 19 other drivers on a narrow circuit with no runoff. A wheel and suspension assembly leaving a car is one of the most dangerous objects in the sport. And motorsport has a long history of marshals and spectators being killed by debris from accidents that nobody intended. So the accusation isn't really that they cheated. Sport has always had cheating. The accusation is that a team instructed an employee to create a high-speed accident in an environment full of people as a strategic tool. And there's a second layer that makes it worse, which is the coercion. Piquet was 23. His seat was in danger. The man asking was both his team principal and his personal manager, meaning the person with total control over his short-term employment and his long-term career was the person making the request. That is not a negotiation between equals. Whatever you think of his decision to do it, and he did do it, and he did it knowing what it was, the situation he was placed in was one where saying no had an obvious and immediate cost, delivered by the person asking. Which is why the immunity decision, controversial as it was probably correct on balance. Without it, the whole thing would never have come out, and a case that requires the most junior and most pressured person involved to incriminate himself with no protection is a case that stays buried. And there's a question that hangs over the whole affair which nobody can answer, which is whether this was the only time. Because the uncomfortable thing about Crashgate is not that it happened, it's that it worked. And it worked so well that it was invisible for a year. Nothing about that race looked wrong at the time. The commentators noted the odd pit stop, moved on, and described the result as a strategic masterstroke. The other teams saw nothing. The stewards saw nothing. The FIA saw nothing. Thousands of people who understand this sport at the highest level watched it live and did not detect it. The only reason it ever surfaced is that a year later, the team sacked the one person who could expose them. Which means the mechanism that caught this was not detection, it was a grudge. And that should be genuinely unsettling. Because if Renault had kept Piquet on for another season, or handled his exit better, or if his father had been a less powerful figure, there is a very reasonable chance the whole thing would simply never have come out. Now, to be clear, there is no evidence that anything like this happened at any other time, and it would be irresponsible to imply otherwise. But the case demonstrated that the sport had no mechanism for finding it, which is a different and more troubling fact than the offence itself. So what actually changed as a result? A few things, and they're mostly quiet. The most concrete is that team principals no longer manage their own drivers. That specific conflict of interest, one person holding both roles, is now understood to be unacceptable, and the arrangement essentially disappeared from the sport. Safety car procedures were tightened over subsequent years, including the introduction of systems that reduce the enormous strategic swing a safety car creates. That was driven by several factors. Not only this, but the demonstration that the swing was large enough to be worth engineering an accident for certainly focused minds. And there's a cultural change that's harder to measure. Before 2008, the idea that a team might deliberately crash a car was not something anybody seriously entertained. It was outside the range of things people thought could happen. Afterwards, it was inside that range, permanently. Which means every subsequent oddly timed incident gets looked at differently. Any time a driver stops on track in a way that conveniently helps a teammate, the accusation surfaces immediately and gets investigated seriously, because the sport now knows it is a thing that has been done. That is the real legacy. Not the fine, because there wasn't one that stuck. Not the bans, because they were annulled. It's that Formula One lost the ability to assume that a crash is an accident. And it's worth following what's happened to the people involved afterwards, because the outcomes are wildly uneven. Nelson Piquet Jr. never drove in Formula One again. He moved to NASCAR in the United States, where he had reasonable success, and later won a championship in Formula E, which is a genuinely significant achievement in a competitive series. So his career continued, but the door back to the top of open-wheel racing was permanently shut. Pat Symonds, after his ban was annulled, returned to Formula One and held senior technical positions at multiple teams, including work on the sport's own technical direction. He is, by any measure, back inside the establishment. Flavio Briatore, after the legal proceedings resolved, gradually returned to the fringes of the paddock, and in recent years has been back in a senior advisory role at a Formula One team. And Fernando Alonso, who was cleared, kept a race win on his record that he would presumably rather not have. So the tally reads: the driver who did it lost his Formula One career, and the two men found responsible for arranging it both eventually returned to the sport in senior positions. You can construct a defense of that. Bans were annulled by a court. People serve their time. Careers shouldn't end permanently for one offence. And Symonds in particular has decades of respected technical work either side of it. But it's worth stating plainly, because it's the actual outcome of the biggest integrity case the sport has had. The junior person is gone. The senior people came back.
And it's worth remembering what the actual competitive game was, because it puts the whole thing in a bleak kind of perspective. A team spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year, employing hundreds of highly skilled people, staffed by some of the best engineers in the world, arranged a deliberate high-speed accident in order to win one race in a season where they were not competitive. Not a championship, one race in a bad year for a car company that wanted a press release. That's the part I keep coming back to. The scale of what was risked against the size of what was actually won.